The easiest $10 million I ever made was convincing my own brother his wife was cheating on him. Daniel Cross froze in the hallway outside his brother's office, his hand still resting on the door he'd been about to push open. He never once asked to see the original files. Never once questioned why I happened to have hotel receipts and text threads sitting ready the exact week he started asking about the trust restructuring. 7 years. Daniel had spent 7 years believing the woman he'd married had betrayed him while carrying his child. 7 years building an empire out of the wreckage of a family he'd walked away from in a single, catastrophic afternoon. And in the time it took his brother to finish one boastful sentence on a phone call he never should have overheard, every certainty Daniel Cross had built his entire adult life on came apart in his hands. What he didn't yet know, standing frozen in that hallway, was that discovering the truth wouldn't feel like relief. It would feel like watching, in slow motion, exactly how much he had thrown away, and understanding that some doors, once closed for 7 years, don't simply reopen because you finally know why you closed them. Have you ever built your entire life around a certainty that turned out to be a lie? Have you ever trusted the wrong person completely, only to discover years later that the person you trusted most had been the architect of your greatest loss? Stay with me, because this is a story about the particular, devastating weight of learning the truth too late to undo what it cost. Hello, my beautiful hearts. Before we begin tonight's story, I want to remind you of something important. Betrayal doesn't only wound the person who was lied about. It can also, quietly and completely, ruin the person who believed the lie. Tonight's story asks something we don't often sit with. What happens to the man who destroyed his own family based on a lie he had every reason to trust? Is redemption always possible? Or are some mistakes simply too large to undo, no matter how sincerely we come to regret them? Let's find out together. The grandfather clock in Naomi Alvarez's Seattle townhouse chimed 4 times, each note settling into the quiet like a small, patient accusation. 7 years ago, at nearly this exact hour, Daniel Cross had stood in the doorway of their nursery, his wedding band already removed, his voice flat with a calm that had terrified her more than any shouting ever could have. "I know what you did," he'd said. "Don't insult either of us by denying it." Now, standing at her kitchen window watching rain streak down the glass, Naomi found herself thinking about that afternoon more than she had in years, because this morning, entirely without warning, she had received an email from Daniel's longtime attorney requesting a conversation about matters concerning their daughter. Naomi's hand moved instinctively to the small gold pendant at her throat, a tiny engraved compass her daughter Iris had given her for Mother's Day 2 years earlier. Iris was 11 now, sharp-eyed and quietly observant in a way that reminded Naomi, uncomfortably, of the father she barely remembered meeting once, briefly, as an infant before he vanished from both their lives entirely. The doorbell rang precisely at 4:15. When Naomi opened it, 7 years collapsed instantly in the space between one breath and the next. Daniel Cross stood on her porch, considerably changed from the driven, restless 34-year-old, who had once built a real estate development empire from nothing but sheer relentless will. At 41, his dark hair carried threads of gray he hadn't earned back then, and his eyes, once so certain, now held something haunted that Naomi had never seen in him during their 5 years of marriage. "Naomi." "Daniel." She stepped back to let him in, keeping careful distance. "You're early. That was always unlike you." He moved past her into the living room, his presence filling the space in the same overwhelming way it always had. And his gaze immediately found the mantel, the collection of framed photographs charting 11 years of a childhood he had never witnessed. He went very still in front of the photo of Iris on her 10th birthday. Cake smeared across her grinning face, dark curls and a determined chin that belonged unmistakably to them both. "Is that?" His voice caught entirely. "Her name is Iris," Naomi said, steady despite the ache rising in her chest. "She'll be 12 in the spring." "I need to tell you how I found out," Daniel said finally, still standing, too restless to sit. "About Julian. About what he did to us." At the mention of Daniel's younger brother, something cold moved through Naomi's chest. She sank into the nearest armchair, gripping the armrests. "Tell me." 3 days ago, Daniel said, his voice hardening with each word, "I went to Julian's office about the Meridian Tower refinancing. His assistant was at lunch. The door was open. I wasn't trying to overhear anything. He turned toward the window, his reflection tight with barely controlled fury. He was on the phone laughing. He said the easiest $10 million he ever made was convincing me you'd betrayed me. That I never once questioned the evidence he handed me. Naomi's breath caught entirely. He said that. Out loud. To someone. To a business associate he was trying to impress. Boasting. Daniel's jaw tightened. I stepped into the room. He saw me and dropped the phone. Spent the next 4 hours trying to talk his way around what I'd clearly already heard. But there was no talking around it, Naomi. I heard every word. He was proud of what he did to us. Naomi closed her eyes, absorbing the particular cruel irony of it. 7 years of devastating silence finally broken not by justice or conscience, but by simple, careless boasting. What did he actually admit to, she asked. Everything. Daniel's voice had gone hollow. The doctored photographs of you outside Marcus Chen's building. The fabricated text exchanges. He paid a hotel desk clerk to falsify guest records showing rooms booked in your name on the weekends I was traveling for the Denver acquisition. And the paternity test, Naomi said quietly, the words she had waited 7 years to hear acknowledged. Completely fabricated, Daniel confirmed. There was no lab. No sample. He had a forged document created by someone he paid off in Portland. He admitted it without a shred of remorse, Naomi. He said it was necessary. That he needed me destabilized, dependent on him again the way I'd been dependent on him when we were children. To understand what drove Julian Cross to destroy his own brother's marriage, you have to go back nearly 30 years, to a cramped apartment above a laundromat in Tacoma, where 2 boys raised themselves largely alone after their mother's second husband disappeared with what little savings the family had left. Daniel, older by 3 years, had taken on the role of provider almost by instinct, working 2 jobs through high school, sacrificing his own opportunities so that Julian, softer and more easily rattled by hardship, could finish school without the same desperate scramble Daniel had endured. Daniel built his construction and development company from nothing in his 20s, driven by a ferocious need to guarantee that neither of them would ever again know the particular helplessness of watching a landlord's eviction notice taped to their door. Julian, meanwhile, drifted from one failed venture to another, always rescued financially by a brother who could never quite bring himself to let his only remaining family fail completely. Daniel gave him positions in the company he wasn't qualified for, covered gambling debts he never fully disclosed, told himself, again and again, that family loyalty meant showing up regardless of the cost. What Daniel never fully understood, not until that overheard phone call 7 years later, was that every act of generosity had deepened, rather than eased, a corrosive resentment Julian had carried since childhood, the specific, festering conviction that Daniel's success had somehow been built on Julian's own diminishment, that being rescued repeatedly by an older brother was its own quiet, permanent humiliation. When Daniel married Naomi, an architect who had built her own respected firm restoring historic buildings across the Pacific Northwest, and when Naomi became pregnant after years of trying, Julian watched his brother assemble exactly the stable, admired life Julian had always believed should have been his by right of being the more naturally charming of the two. I'm worried about Naomi, Julian told Daniel over drinks one evening, nearly 6 months before the confrontation that would end the marriage. She seems distracted, distant. She's 7 months pregnant, running a design firm, and helping coordinate our foundation's new housing initiative, Daniel had said, irritation edging his voice. Of course she's distracted. Julian had held up both hands in mock surrender. Forget I said anything. It was not nothing. It was the deliberate opening move of a months-long campaign, careful, patient, and devastatingly effective, because Julian understood, better than almost anyone alive, precisely which insecurities still lived quietly beneath his brother's confident exterior. Why didn't you just ask me? Naomi's voice, when it finally came, carried 7 years of the question she had never gotten to ask directly. After 5 years of marriage, Daniel, how could you believe I would do that to you without even giving me the chance to defend myself? Daniel sank onto the sofa, the weight of the day settling visibly into his shoulders. Because I was a fool who let his brother weaponize the one fear I never told anyone about. What fear? That I wasn't actually built for the life I'd made, Daniel admitted, his voice raw in a way Naomi had rarely heard from him during their marriage. The kid from above the laundromat who clawed his way into rooms he didn't feel he belonged in. When Julian handed me those photographs, that fabricated test, some part of me had already been waiting 7 years for proof that eventually you'd realize you'd married beneath what you actually deserved. The raw honesty of the admission stunned her into silence for a long moment. In 5 years of marriage, Daniel had rarely spoken of the specific shape of his own insecurities. That's not an excuse, she finally said, standing, the old anger flaring hot and sudden. Do you have any idea what it was like being 7 months pregnant and abandoned, Daniel? Watching our friends, our colleagues, everyone we knew wondering what terrible thing I must have done to make you walk away without a word of explanation to anyone. I know, he said quietly. I've had 7 years to imagine exactly what that must have been like, and I still don't think I fully understand it. You tracked down the hotel clerk, Naomi said slowly, processing. You confirmed it yourself before you came here. I needed to see it completely, Naomi. Every piece of it. I couldn't come to you with half a truth. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a thick envelope, setting it carefully on the coffee table between them. It's everything. The original materials Julian gave me. The proof I've since gathered showing exactly how each piece was manufactured. I know it doesn't undo what I did. Nothing can undo 7 years, Naomi. But I needed you to have it. The doorbell interrupted them before Naomi could respond, and her stomach dropped as she checked the time. That's Iris. She's home early from her father's. Daniel's entire body went still. Her father's? Naomi hesitated, watching something complicated move across his face. Daniel, I need to tell you something before she comes in. Tell me. I remarried 3 years ago, Naomi said carefully. His name is Theo. He's a pediatric nurse. He's been in Iris's life since she was 7 years old, and he is, as far as she's concerned, her father in every way that has actually mattered to her daily life. Daniel's face went through several rapid transformations, hope curdling immediately into something far more painful. I see. I'm not telling you this to hurt you, Naomi said, though her voice carried an edge of something that might have been, despite everything, a flicker of guilt she resented feeling. I'm telling you because whatever comes next between you and Iris has to happen within that reality, not instead of it. The front door opened before Daniel could respond, and a girl with dark curls and an unmistakably familiar determined chin walked in mid-sentence, describing something about a science fair project, before stopping abruptly at the sight of a stranger sitting stiffly on her mother's sofa. Behind her, a tall, kind-faced man in scrubs paused in the doorway, immediately reading the tension in the room. Iris, Naomi said gently. This is Daniel. He's an old friend. Iris studied him with the same solemn, assessing intensity Daniel recognized, uncomfortably, as his own. You have my eyes, she said with the blunt honesty of an 11-year-old who has not yet learned to soften observations for adult comfort. You have your mother's, Daniel managed, his voice unsteady in a way Naomi had never once heard from him during their marriage. Theo crossed the room and extended a hand toward Daniel with careful, deliberate politeness. Theo Alvarez. I don't believe we've met. Daniel Cross, Daniel said, shaking the offered hand, something in his expression suggesting he understood, with sudden and total clarity, exactly what he was looking at. Iris disappeared toward her room a few minutes later, still curious about the strange man, but easily redirected by Theo's gentle suggestion that she finish the science fair report before dinner. Once the 3 adults were alone, the room settled into a silence heavy with everything that remained unspoken. I should go, Daniel said finally, rising. I've clearly disrupted your evening. Daniel, Naomi said, and something in her voice made him pause. I'm not going to pretend the last hour hasn't been complicated. You deserve to know the truth about what happened to us, and you deserve, if you want it, a relationship with Iris going forward. She deserves to know where half of herself comes from. I've always believed that, even during the years I was angriest at you for taking it away from her. But, Daniel said quietly, hearing what remained unspoken. But I'm not the woman you left 7 years ago, Naomi said, gently but without hesitation. I built an entire life without you, Daniel. A business, a home, a marriage to a man who has never once, in 3 years, given me a single reason to doubt him. I'm not interested in reopening a door I spent years carefully closing, no matter how thoroughly the reasons behind it turn out to have been lies. Daniel absorbed this in silence, something in his expression suggesting he had, on some level, already known exactly what her answer would be before he'd rung the doorbell. I understand, he said finally, and to his credit he did not argue. I want you to know Iris, Naomi continued. Slowly on her terms, with a therapist involved to help her process who you are and why you were absent for so long. But I need you to understand something clearly, Daniel. This isn't a second chance for us. It's a first chance for her to know her biological father, nothing more. Julian Cross's downfall, once it began, unfolded with a speed that surprised even Daniel. Confronted with the recorded confession his own boasting had inadvertently provided, Julian first attempted denial, then partial admission, then, when Daniel produced the forged hotel records and the falsified paternity documentation obtained through his own investigation, a final, desperate justification that revealed more about Julian's character than any accusation could have. You had everything, Julian spat, cornered in Daniel's downtown office with legal counsel present on both sides. The company, the wife, the family. What was I supposed to do? Live in your shadow forever? I would have given you anything you asked for, Daniel said, and for the first time in the confrontation, genuine pain broke through his controlled fury. You were my brother. All you ever had to do was ask. I didn't want your charity, Julian said, his voice cracking. I wanted to matter. I wanted, just once, for something to be mine that wasn't handed down from you. The raw admission seemed to surprise even Julian himself, and for a moment, something like shame flickered across his face before hardening back into defensive resentment. Daniel declined to press criminal charges related to the destruction of his marriage, a decision his attorneys strongly advised against but one he insisted upon, telling Naomi later that some form of accountability felt more important to him than punishment. Julian was, however, removed entirely from every position of financial trust within Cross Development, his equity holdings restructured into a trust he could draw from only for verified medical and living expenses, and the falsified hotel records and forged laboratory documents were formally reported to the appropriate licensing boards, resulting in Julian facing separate legal consequences for the fraud itself, entirely apart from Daniel's own choices. Julian left Seattle within the year, and the brothers have not spoken since. The following months unfolded slowly and carefully, exactly as Naomi had insisted they would. Daniel met with Iris every other weekend, initially in supervised sessions with a family therapist present, gradually easing into simple, ordinary time together, dinners, a shared interest in astronomy that Iris had apparently inherited from a grandmother Daniel barely remembered, quiet Sunday mornings at a small planetarium downtown that became, slowly, a ritual neither of them discussed but both clearly treasured. Theo, to his considerable credit, never once treated Daniel's presence as a threat to be managed rather than a reality to be navigated with grace. The two men developed, over time, a careful, respectful working relationship built entirely around Iris's well-being, coordinating schedules, attending school events together with the particular awkward civility of men who understood, without ever quite discussing it directly, that they occupied genuinely different roles in the same child's life. Daniel poured himself into those relationships with an intensity that surprised everyone who had known him during his years of relentless business expansion. He scaled back his company's growth trajectory for the first time in a decade, delegated responsibilities he had once refused to share with anyone, and began slowly to build something he had never actually had before, a life with room in it for something other than the singular, driving fear of failure that had defined him since childhood. But the particular grief Daniel carried through those months never fully lifted, because unlike the story he might once have imagined, unlike the version where truth arrives just in time to save everything, Daniel Cross had learned, at considerable cost, that some truths arrive precisely on schedule to reveal exactly what you've permanently lost. 18 months after that first difficult afternoon in Naomi's living room, Daniel sat alone in his penthouse office on a Sunday evening, the city lights spreading out below him in the particular loneliness of a life built successfully, but incompletely. Iris had spent the afternoon with him at the planetarium, animated and easy in his company in a way that still, every single time, caught somewhere painful in his chest. His phone buzzed. A photograph from Naomi, Iris grinning beside a science fair ribbon. A small gesture of ordinary co-parenting courtesy that had become, over the preceding months, a quiet fixture of their careful new arrangement. Daniel stared at the photograph for a long time before setting the phone down. He thought, as he often did in these quiet evening hours, about the particular architecture of everything Julian's lie had cost him. Not simply 5 years of marriage, not simply the first 4 years of his daughter's life, but something considerably harder to name, the specific version of himself he might have become if he had simply trusted the woman standing in front of him 7 years earlier, instead of the brother whispering in his ear. He would never fully know that man. The truth, once it finally arrived, hadn't restored what was taken. It had simply illuminated, with perfect, unforgiving clarity, exactly how much had been lost, and exactly how permanently. He thought sometimes about calling Naomi, not to reopen anything. He understood by now, with total and painful clarity, that the door she had described that first afternoon really had closed, carefully and completely, but simply to say something he had never adequately said. That he understood now what his doubt had cost, not just her, but the man he might have been. He never made the call. Some understandings he had come to accept exist best as private weight carried quietly rather than confessions offered for absolution neither of them particularly needed anymore. Iris turned 13 the following spring, and Daniel attended her birthday dinner as he now regularly did, seated at a table that included Naomi, Theo, Naomi's mother, and a small collection of Iris's closest friends. He brought a telescope, carefully chosen after months of listening to his daughter describe constellations with the same intense, methodical curiosity he recognized, uncomfortably and with a complicated pride, as entirely his own. Watching Iris unwrap the gift, her genuine delight lighting up the room, Daniel felt something he had learned, across 18 difficult months, to recognize clearly for exactly what it was, a particular kind of grief that coexists permanently alongside genuine joy. The specific ache of loving someone fully in a life you only get to occupy partially, the cost of 7 lost years that no amount of present devotion could ever fully repay. Naomi caught his eye across the table at one point, and something passed between them, not romantic longing. That door, as she had told him plainly and correctly a year and a half earlier, had genuinely and permanently closed, but something quieter and in its own way more honest. A shared, complicated tenderness rooted entirely in the daughter they had built together, and nearly lost each other over completely. "You're doing well with her," Naomi said quietly, finding him alone on the porch later that evening while Theo helped clean up inside. "Better than I expected, honestly." "I'm trying," Daniel said. "It doesn't undo anything." "No," Naomi agreed, without cruelty, simply stating what they both already understood completely. "It doesn't. But it matters anyway, Daniel." To her, and I think in whatever way still counts, to me too. I think about Daniel Cross's story often, and I think the detail that stays with me longest isn't the dramatic confrontation with his brother, satisfying as that reckoning eventually was. It's the quiet ache of that final scene on the porch, a man who finally received the truth he'd spent 7 years unknowingly needing, only to discover that truth couldn't rewind a single day of what his doubt had already cost. Some stories end in reconciliation. This one ends somewhere more honest, and in its own difficult way, more true to how betrayal actually works. Not every door reopens simply because we finally understand why we walked through the wrong one. If this story reminded you of a truth that arrived too late to undo its damage, or a moment when trust, once broken, never fully returned even after forgiveness was offered, I want to hear about it in the comments below. My beautiful hearts, remember this. Sometimes healing doesn't look like getting back what we lost. Sometimes it looks like building something honest and worthwhile out of what remains, even when what remains is smaller than what we once had. That doesn't make the new thing worthless. It simply makes it real. If tonight's story moved you, share it with someone still carrying the weight of a truth they wish had arrived sooner, and subscribe, because I'll be back next week with another story about the particular, complicated cost of trust, betrayal, and the truths we sometimes learn far too late to undo what they cost us. Until then, hold on to your own truth, even when it arrives on its own difficult schedule. You deserve to know it, whatever it eventually costs.